tombs. Jacob Bowen had dug one grave. He had never expected to need a second one. And before this story is over, you are going to understand exactly why that second grave became necessary, and exactly who it was for. Stay with me, because the answer is not what you think it is. And the truth, when it finally arrives, is going to ask you a question about grief and love and identity that you are going to be turning over in your mind long after this video ends. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in Caldwell Crossing in the winter of 1887, you need to sit with 3 questions that this story refuses to answer easily. The first, if the woman Jacob buried in October was truly Eleanor Bowen, who was the woman who rode in 3 months later, knowing things about Eleanor's life that only Eleanor could have known. The second, if the woman who rode in was truly Eleanor Bowen, then who was in that grave? And the third, the one that is going to keep you here until the very last minute of this video. Why did Jacob Bowen, the man who had loved Eleanor Bowen for 14 years, take 3 weeks to decide which one of them was his wife? 3 weeks. The man looked at a woman who claimed to be his wife, who spoke like his wife, who knew the private details of their life together that no stranger could have fabricated, and he spent 3 weeks not being certain. What does a man know in 3 weeks that he did not know in 3 days? And what does a town do while it waits for a husband to recognize his own wife? The answers to those questions will tell you everything about Caldwell Crossing that Caldwell Crossing would never tell you about itself. Caldwell Crossing sat at the intersection of 2 cattle trails in West Texas, in a place the land had clearly not intended for permanent habitation, but which stubborn human beings had insisted upon anyway. It was a town of approximately 400 people in 1887, most of them connected to cattle in one way or another, all of them connected to each other in the way that 400 people sharing a water source and a post office inevitably become connected, thoroughly and without much privacy. It had a church, a school, a general store, a saloon that the church disapproved of, and the particular social ecosystem that develops when everyone knows everything about everyone and has opinions about most of it. The Bowen Ranch sat 3 miles north of town on a modest spread that Jacob had built from nothing over 12 years. It was not the largest operation in the county. It was not the most profitable, but it was solid and honest, and it was his in the way that things you build with your own hands become yours, not just legally, but in your bones. 4:30 to 6:15 Eleanor Bowen, before everything changed. Eleanor Bowen was 31 years old in the fall of 1887, and she was the kind of woman that Caldwell Crossing had strong feelings about without always being able to articulate exactly why. She was not conventionally quiet. She had opinions about things that women in Caldwell Crossing were not always expected to have opinions about: land rights and education, and the particular brand of casual injustice that small Texas towns administered so smoothly it barely registered as injustice at all. She taught at the Caldwell Crossing School 3 days a week and spent the other 4 running the domestic operations of the Bowen Ranch with the same precise competence she brought to everything she did. She and Jacob had been married 14 years. They had no children, which was a detail the town had noted and filed away in the particular way that towns file away the details of childless marriages, with a combination of sympathy and quiet judgment that the couple in question can always feel without anyone ever saying it directly. What they had instead of children was a partnership so complete and so genuinely equal that it made some people in Caldwell Crossing uncomfortable in ways they could not entirely explain. Eleanor had a habit of humming while she worked that Jacob had mentioned to 3 different people over 14 years as the thing he would miss most if she were ever gone. He said it in the casual way that people say things they do not yet believe will be tested. He said it the way you describe someone's most ordinary quality, when you have no reason to imagine a life without it. In September of 1887, Eleanor Bowen became ill. What happened over the following 6 weeks, and what Jacob Bowen did and did not understand about those 6 weeks, is the foundation on which everything else in this story is built. The fever came in the first week of September. It was not an unusual thing in West Texas in 1887. Fevers came and went with the seasons, and most people survived them and went back to their lives with nothing more than a week of lost work to show for it. Eleanor's did not follow that pattern. It deepened and persisted through September and into October in a way that frightened Jacob, with the quiet, escalating terror of someone watching something they love move toward an edge they cannot see the bottom of. The doctor came 3 times. He was a man named Silas Webb who had been practicing medicine in Caldwell Crossing for 20 years and who had the particular combination of genuine skill and honest limitation that characterizes the best country doctors of that era. He told Jacob on his 3rd visit in mid-October that Eleanor's fever had reached a point where he could not in good conscience promise what the next several days would bring. He said it carefully and with genuine sorrow. Jacob sat with that information for one night and then did what men of that time and place did when they were given information they could not absorb. He went back to work and did not speak of it. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in late October. Jacob was beside her. He had been beside her for the last 4 days, without sleeping more than an hour at a stretch. The town came to the burial the following Thursday in the way that small towns come to their own, completely and with genuine grief, because Eleanor Bowen had been genuinely known and genuinely loved by most of the people who stood at that graveside in the red Texas earth with the autumn wind moving through the dry grass around them. Jacob Bowen stood at that grave with his hat in his hands and his face doing nothing at all. The people of Caldwell Crossing who knew him well said afterward that it was the most frightening thing they had ever seen. Not the grief, but the absence of it on his face. The absolute empty stillness of a man whose internal landscape had simply stopped. The 3 months between Eleanor's burial in October and the stranger's arrival in January were the months that the people of Caldwell Crossing watched Jacob Bowen with the careful attention that communities give to people they are genuinely worried about. He functioned. He fed the cattle. He maintained the ranch. He came to town when he needed supplies and exchanged the minimum necessary words with the minimum necessary people, and went back out the 3 miles to his ranch and resumed the quiet that had apparently become the entire texture of his life. He stopped going to church. This was noted. He stopped coming to the social gatherings that Caldwell Crossing organized with the regularity of a town that understands that its own survival depends on maintaining the fabric of community life. This was noted more urgently. He lost weight in the visible, steady way of a man who is eating because he understands it is necessary rather than because it means anything to him. The one thing he did during those 3 months that anyone later thought to mention was this. He visited Eleanor's grave every single evening without exception. Every evening at the same time regardless of weather. He did not stay long. He did not appear to speak. He stood for a few minutes and then walked back to his horse and rode home. The grave was always tended, always clean, always with some small evidence of care that he refreshed each evening before he left. He was visiting that grave on a January evening in 1888 when he looked up and saw a woman on a gray horse coming up the road toward him. And something in how she sat that horse stopped every thought he was having in its tracks. She pulled up at the cemetery gate and looked at him across the space between them for a moment that Jacob Bowen would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. Then she said his name. She said it in Eleanor's voice. She said it with Eleanor's particular inflection, the slight rise at the end that had always sounded more like a greeting than a statement. She said, "Jacob," and then she said, "I know what this looks like. I know what you buried, but I need you to listen to me." Jacob Bowen stood at his wife's grave in the January cold and listened to a woman who sounded exactly like Eleanor Bowen tell him that she was Eleanor Bowen, that the fever had not killed her, that she had woken. She used that word deliberately, carefully, woken, in circumstances she needed to explain, that she had spent 3 months finding her way back to him, and that she understood if he needed time to believe her. She said that last part with Eleanor's particular combination of patience and precision that had always made Jacob feel that he was being both forgiven and challenged simultaneously. He did not speak for a very long time. Then he said one word. He said, "How?" And she told him. What she told him was either the most extraordinary true account of survival anyone in Caldwell Crossing had ever heard, or it was a fabrication so detailed and so intimate that it required a level of research and preparation that pointed towards something far more calculated and far more frightening than a simple lie. Her name, she said, was Eleanor Bowen. Born Eleanor Grace Mercer in a small Louisiana parish in 1856. Married Jacob Bowen in the spring of 1873 at the age of 17. The story she told him there at the cemetery gate in the January cold covered the events of 6 weeks with a specificity and an intimacy that made Jacob's hands shake. She described details of their life together, private details, small domestic ones, the kind that do not appear in any public record and cannot be researched from the outside. She described the way he took his coffee. She described the argument they had in July about the north fence line and the exact words he had used at the end of it that he had always regretted. She described the sound Eleanor made when she was reading something that surprised her. She described it from the inside, the way you describe your own habit, not from the outside the way you describe someone else's. What she said happened to her was this. The fever had reached its deepest point on a Monday night, the night before Jacob believed she died. In that deepest point, something had occurred that she could only describe as a kind of departure, not death. Something adjacent to death that was not death. She had come back to consciousness not in her own bed, but in a house 12 miles east of Caldwell Crossing belonging to a family named Darnell who had found her. She did not know how, and nursed her back to something approaching health over 3 months without knowing who she was because she had not been able to tell them. The fever had taken her memory of herself for 3 months. It came back in pieces, and when it came back fully enough for her to understand where she was and what had apparently happened in her absence, she had gotten on a horse and ridden back. Jacob Bowen took the woman home to his ranch that night. He did not tell anyone in Caldwell Crossing what had happened. He did not send word to the doctor or the minister or any of the neighbors who had stood at Eleanor's grave 3 months earlier. He took her inside the house that had been Eleanor's house, and he made her coffee, and he sat across the kitchen table from her, and he looked at her for a long time. And then he asked her a question that only Eleanor would know the answer to. She answered it correctly. He asked her another. She answered that one correctly too. He asked her a third. She answered it. He asked her 7 questions in total. She answered every single one correctly without hesitation. And then Jacob Bowen put his face in his hands at his kitchen table and did not move for a very long time. He did not tell the town for 3 weeks. The story reached Caldwell Crossing the way all stories reach small towns. Not through any official announcement, but through the particular social osmosis that operates when someone sees something and tells someone else who tells 3 others before sundown. A neighbor of Jacob's spotted the woman hanging washing on the line at the Bowen Ranch on a gray February morning and recognized Eleanor Bowen's posture before he recognized her face and nearly fell off his horse. By evening, half of Caldwell Crossing knew. By the following morning, the other half knew. And by the afternoon of that second day, Jacob Bowen's kitchen had more visitors than it had seen since Eleanor's funeral. The town's reaction divided almost immediately into 2 camps, with a smaller third group that simply could not decide. The first camp, anchored primarily by the women who had known Eleanor Bowen most closely and had grieved her most genuinely, looked at this woman and heard her speak and watched her move and said with varying degrees of certainty that this was Eleanor. That she sounded right and moved right and knew things that only Eleanor could know, and that whatever impossible thing had happened was less impossible than the alternative. The second camp, anchored primarily by the men who had stood at that grave and then watched Jacob deteriorate for 3 months, said that what was in that grave was Eleanor Bowen, and that the woman in Jacob's kitchen was a very accomplished and very dangerous liar, and that someone needed to protect Jacob from whatever this was before it destroyed what little was left of him. The third group, the ones who could not decide, said the thing that nobody else was willing to say. They said that Jacob himself did not seem certain, and that his uncertainty, 3 weeks in, was the most frightening detail of the entire situation. The town eventually prevailed upon Dr. Silas Webb to go to the Bowen Ranch and examine the woman. He went reluctantly, and with the expression of a man who does not expect the situation to become clearer as a result of his involvement. He spent 2 hours at the ranch. He examined her. He spoke with her at length. He reviewed his own medical records of Eleanor Bowen's illness and final days. And then he came back to town and said something that helped nobody at all. He said that medically he could not rule out that this woman was Eleanor Bowen. He also said that medically he could not confirm it. He said that the fever Eleanor Bowen had suffered was of a type that he had seen produce extraordinary outcomes in a small number of cases. Outcomes that in less rigorous times might have been described as miraculous, and that a recovery of this kind, while vanishingly rare, was not outside the boundaries of what he had read in medical literature. He also said that someone was buried in Eleanor Bowen's grave. and that he thought they should probably know who it was. The decision to open Eleanor Bowen's grave was the most controversial thing Caldwell Crossing had done in 20 years of controversial decisions. And what they found when they opened it raised a question that was so much worse than the one they had been asking that 3 people present had to be helped away from the graveside. The grave was opened on a cold February morning with the county sheriff present, Dr. Webb present, the minister present, and Jacob Bowen conspicuously absent. He had refused to attend. He had said simply that he had already buried his wife once, and he was not going to participate in doing it again regardless of what anyone found. The woman who claimed to be Eleanor was also absent. Jacob had asked her not to come, and she had agreed with the particular quiet compliance of someone who understands that they are in a position where compliance is the only currency available to them. What the grave contained was not nothing. There was a body. What the body was not, and this is the detail that sent 3 people stumbling away from the graveside and kept Caldwell Crossing talking for the next 6 months, was female. The body in Eleanor Bowen's grave was the body of a man of approximately 40 years of age, of medium height and lean build, dressed in clothing that nobody at the graveside recognized. He had no identifying documents. He had no personal effects of any kind. He had no connection to Caldwell Crossing that anyone could immediately establish. He was simply a dead man in a woman's grave in a West Texas cemetery, and his presence there raised a question so vast and so strange that the sheriff stood at the edge of that open grave for a very long time before he was able to form it into words. If this man was in Eleanor Bowen's grave, who had Jacob Bowen buried? And who had put this man here instead? The sheriff. A man named Cotton Hayes who had been keeping order in Caldwell Crossing for 11 years and had believed until this February morning that he had seen most of what a Texas county could produce, began his investigation with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understands that the only way through an impossible situation is one verifiable fact at a time. He established first that the grave had been properly witnessed at the burial, for people confirmed they had seen a body in a coffin, though none could swear with absolute certainty to having seen Eleanor Bowen's face clearly. He established second that Dr. Silas Webb had signed Eleanor Bowen's death certificate based on his own examination, but Webb now acknowledged with visible discomfort that he had examined Eleanor in the final stages of a fever that had already deeply altered her appearance. He established third that between the death and the burial a period of approximately 48 hours had elapsed during which the coffin had been in the care of the undertaker, a man named Percy Gill who had died of a heart attack in November, 6 weeks after the burial, taking whatever he knew with him. The dead man in the grave was eventually identified through a wanted notice that the sheriff found in a 3-month-old stack of correspondence from the Texas Ranger office. His name was believed to be James Cutter. He was wanted in connection with a land fraud operation that had been operating across 3 Texas counties for approximately 2 years. He had no known connection to Caldwell Crossing. He had no known connection to Eleanor Bowen. And he had absolutely no known reason to be in a grave with her name on it, unless someone had put him there deliberately, and unless that someone had a reason to make the world believe that Eleanor Bowen was dead. The truth came out over 3 weeks of investigation that Cotton Hayes conducted with the growing sense of a man who has pulled one thread and watched an entire garment come apart. It came out in pieces, each piece more extraordinary than the last, and the complete picture that emerged was one that Caldwell Crossing spent years afterward arguing about. Not because the facts were disputed, but because the facts required people to completely revise their understanding of someone they thought they knew. Eleanor Bowen, the real Eleanor Bowen, the woman who had come back on the gray horse, had not recovered from her fever by accident. She had been helped. The Darnell family who found her 12 miles east of Caldwell Crossing had not found her by chance. She had been taken there, deliberately, in the night, by someone who knew she was dying and knew what would happen to her if she died in Caldwell Crossing with Jacob Bowen as her only heir and protector. The land fraud operation that James Cutter had been part of had a longer reach than the Texas Rangers had understood. It had been operating not just across 3 counties, but with deliberate patience inside specific communities, identifying ranches with weak legal title, engineering circumstances that would transfer ownership, and in at least 2 documented cases arranging the deaths of people who stood in the way of those transfers. The Bowen Ranch had been on their list for over a year. Eleanor had discovered this, She had stumbled across documentation in the county records office 3 months before her fever, documentation that implicated not just Cutter, but 2 other men whose names were known in Caldwell Crossing, and she had been in the process of deciding what to do with what she had found when the fever arrived. James Cutter had not been killed by Eleanor or by Jacob. He had been killed by his own partners when he threatened to expose them in exchange for a reduced sentence on a separate charge. His body had been placed in Eleanor's grave by the same partners who had arranged for Eleanor to be removed from Caldwell Crossing alive, because a living Eleanor 12 miles away and recovering from fever was less dangerous to their operation than a dead Eleanor, whose death would trigger an investigation into the ranch's title. They had needed Eleanor Bowen to simply disappear, and for 3 months she had. What they had not anticipated was Eleanor Bowen's memory coming back. What they had not anticipated was Eleanor Bowen getting on a horse. And what they had most catastrophically failed to anticipate was Cotton Hayes pulling a 3-month-old wanted notice out of a pile of correspondence and recognizing a name. 2 of the men implicated in the land fraud conspiracy were residents of Caldwell Crossing. One of them had stood at Eleanor Bowen's grave in October and wept. And both of them were still there when Cotton Hayes came looking. The 2 men were arrested in March of 1888. Their trial drew observers from 4 counties and lasted 11 days. Both were convicted, one of conspiracy and land fraud, the other of the same charges plus complicity in the death of James Cutter, whose murder was eventually laid at his door by the testimony of a 3rd associate who chose cooperation over silence. Both men went to the state penitentiary. The Bowen Ranch retained its title. The fraudulent claims against it were voided by court order. Eleanor Bowen went back to teaching at the Caldwell Crossing School in the fall of 1888. The town received her back with the particular combination of genuine relief and residual discomfort that communities experience when they have behaved badly during someone's absence and are not entirely sure how to account for themselves. Eleanor made it easy for them in the way that certain remarkable women make difficult things easy, not by pretending the difficulty did not exist, but by refusing to let it define what came next. She went back to her classroom. She went back to her students. She went back to humming while she worked. Jacob Bowen never fully explained those 3 weeks between her arrival and his decision to tell the town. When people asked, and many did, he said only that he had needed to be certain. When they pressed him on why 3 weeks were required when 7 questions had been answered correctly on the first night, he said something that people in Caldwell Crossing repeated to each other for years afterward. He said, "I was not uncertain about who she was. I was uncertain about who I had become in the months she was gone, and I needed to know whether the man she came back to was someone worth coming back to." There is one more detail that Cotton Hayes included in his official report and that I have been saving for this moment, because it is the detail that reframes everything about this story that you thought you already understood. The grave marker. The one that had stood over James Cutter's body with Eleanor Bowen's name on it for 3 months, while Jacob visited it every single evening. Jacob Bowen had carved it himself. He had spent an entire night on it, the night before the burial, carving Eleanor's name and the dates of her life into a piece of oak with a care and a precision that the undertaker Percy Gill had mentioned to 2 people as the most devoted thing he had ever witnessed a grieving man do. Jacob had carved that marker for a man he did not know was there. He had tended that grave every evening for 3 months for a man who had been placed there by the people who had taken his wife. And the marker he had made with his own hands had stood over the wrong grave the entire time. He removed it the morning after the exhumation. He did not replace it with anything. He left that corner of the Caldwell Crossing cemetery empty and unmarked, and he never spoke about it again. The second grave, the one the title of this story promised you, was never dug. Not because it was not needed, but because the person it would have been for came back. And because Jacob Bowen had already learned, in the most devastating possible way, that the act of digging a grave does not mean the story is over. It sometimes means the story has barely begun. So I want to leave you with this. We spend our lives believing that the hardest thing we will ever do is bury someone we love. Jacob Bowen learned something different. He learned that the hardest thing, the thing that requires more courage than grief, more strength than loss, more faith than any act of burial, is being willing to believe that what you buried might come back, and being honest enough about who you have become in the meantime to ask whether you deserve the return. Was the Eleanor who came back the same Eleanor who left? Was the Jacob who received her the same Jacob she had loved for 14 years? And does it matter if what they built in the space after was something truer than what they had before? This has been just one more story